Lou, please go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I beg your indulgence. You know, one of the things I was going to do is to try to start at a later point in time, but the story that I'm going to present, which is probably a little bit different from most of the story that you hear as it relates to the land of two rights making a wrong. I want to preface it with a couple of things. Okay, so first, I'm going to tell you that I'm 50% according to 23andMe and the other one, Ancestry, 50% Ashkenazi for my father's side. I have Jewish relatives. I support the existence of Israel. I visited several times. I did live in the Middle East, particularly in Cairo, for 4 years. I try to look at facts and evidence and try to just stay away from moral judgments, even though that's very difficult to do, and biases. I understand the complexity and emotional aspects of the issues. If those who are on Zoom could please mute, I would appreciate it. I understand the complexities and emotional aspects. And to me, this is the story of the failure to accept the principle of half a loaf. That's a half a loaf of bread. Okay. I also recognize the pain that the current situation has caused, first by the most barbaric act by Hamas, for which there's no justification. It did so to create fear and to ensure massive retaliation. Hamas, you have to understand, is part of a broader fundamentalist Islamic approach, a belief system that began with, if you want to call him a philosopher, Hassan al-Banna, and took root in Egypt. It also advocates for a philosophy called takfirism, which is giving you permission to kill other Muslims who don't abide by your own belief system, which is actually anti-Islamic, period. Not that they haven't been doing it for centuries, but this was more formalized. And it rejects any Western values except when it benefits them, such as the dividends that Hamas has been garnering from the investment funds that are handled primarily in Turkey. And it's why Egypt blockades Gaza, because they see the Muslim Brethren, Ikhwan Muslimin, as a threat. And they've been fighting them, actually, for the last 30 years, guerrilla groups in the Sinai.
You want
to? Haven't disappeared. Could you please mute?
If it's too loud, I'll leave.
Please mute.
That's me.
Okay. That's Emery. Please mute. Thank you. Okay. So, and Hamas was elected, even though they didn't get majorities. Unfortunately, the Fatah put up too many candidates, and they won the majority of seats that put them in power, and there hasn't been an election since. And I'll talk a little bit, but not much more. So this talk is really designed not to focus on the immediate past action, but on the historical factors that have led to this point and the U.S. role in the story. It's to shed light. How can I mute this guy? Yeah, but hold on.
You gotta mute it, honey.
Okay. Usually it's shoot. I need everybody on Zoom to mute. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So, I'm going to give a slightly different texture to the rather simplistic story that has been fed to the American public for many years. Okay. Let me get rid of this. Oops, because now I can't see. Whoops. Here, one. Here we go. All right. So, um, I didn't intend to go all the way back, but I have to be able to tell the story. So the Balfour Declaration and Herzl's Judenstaat emanate from nationalism, which is a European concept that derived from late 17th and into the 18th century particularly, and really took root after the French Revolution and Napoleonism. So, you know, if Serbians and Croats, et cetera, who all wanted to get out of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, could do it, you know, Herzl and others said, well, why the hell can't we, since there are pogroms against our people, especially in Eastern Europe. And on that, and I talked to this when talking about Ukraine, the fact is that the Polish ruling class landowners that owned Ukraine brought the Jews to act as their agents, and the Jews were fleeing primarily from Monrovia and from German principalities where there would be occasional outbreaks of violence. And they were given many rights and they thrived for 500 years, with the exception of the Chominsky revolt, which it was an aberration because they acted as the agents of the Polish ruling class. They weren't allowed to own land, but they had their own judicial system, etc. And they developed a real culture, okay, and philosophical thinking. You know, the Hasidic schools of thought, etc., all emanated. So it thrived until Poland was partitioned, and the ruling class no longer had any party to it. And the second factor was serfs gained their freedom, and the serfs resented the hell out of the Poles and the Jews, who they saw as their agents. Okay, and that's when the pogroms start. Now, there was a lack of Zionist support from Jews in Europe and in the U.S. prior to World War II. Every Congress absolutely vehemently opposed to this concept, and I'll explain a little bit more. So Thomas Herzl, who was seen and actually called in Israel basically the intellectual father of Israel, you know, he wrote, "We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border." He's talking about the Arabs, by procuring employment for it in transit countries while denying it any employment in our own country. Expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. Ben-Gurion, 40 years later, at the 20th Zionist Congress, said, "You are no doubt aware of the Jewish National Fund's activities in this respect. Now, a transfer of a completely different scope will have to be carried out in many parts of the country. New settlements will not be possible without transferring the Arab Fellaheen." He concluded, "Jewish power in Palestine, which grows steadily, will also increase our possibility to carry this out, to carry this transfer on a large scale." And Joseph Weitz, who was director of the Jewish National Fund Land Department, who the Jewish Agency ended up owning 40% of the land, and the Jewish Colonization Association another 26, and there were 4 other that basically became 90% of the Jewish land that was purchased in Palestine from Ottomans, you know, absentee landlords. It's a little bit more complicated, and I'll briefly get into it, but White said there's no way besides transferring the Arabs from here to neighboring countries and to transfer all of them, save perhaps the Arabs of Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Jerusalem. Not one village must be left, not one Bedouin tribe, and only after this transfer will the country be able to absorb millions of our brothers, and the Jewish problem will cease to exist. There's no other solution. So I want to, you know, this is about foreign affairs and the U.S. role. You know, it actually started earlier than most people think. In the 1830s, there was U.S. missionary presence in Palestine and in Greater Syria. they had an influence on the more wealthy, educated, where concepts like nationalism was brought to them. And up until that point, remember, the Arabs there were under Ottoman rule for almost 500 years. Okay, so they also were intent on conversion. First U.S. Uh, uh, consular presence was in the 1850s. This is a very interesting detail. In 1891, there was the Blackstone Memorial written by Eugene Blackstone, a Christian restorationist, you might call him evangelical, who was in favor of the delivery of Palestine to the Jews. This is before Judenstadt, and signed by 431 of the leading Protestant university presidents, legislators, etc., and submitted to President Harrison. They were concerned by two things: the pogroms in Eastern Europe, in Tsarist Russia in particular, and the massive immigration of Jews to the United States, the population of which went from 250,000 in 1870s to almost 3.5 million by 1922. Okay, it wasn't all because they were having fun procreating. 2 million Jews emigrated to the United States. So there's I would say, also an anti-Semitic component to it, not just an altruistic one. The memorial didn't go anywhere. Actually, the only copy of it is housed at Billy Graham's University of North Carolina. A second memorial was brought up by later Supreme Court Justice Brandeis, who's got same number of signatories, etc., and others. Presented it to Woodrow Wilson, who was a very religious guy. In May of 1917, again, precedes the Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration, which I've written in part, and I think the highlighted in yellow, which you may not be able to read, but His Majesty's view. Please mute if you're on Zoom, because we can hear you. His Majesty's government view would favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home. What does legally that mean? For the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that, quote, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Because most Jews were very concerned about what the implication to them would be in Europe and in the United States. That they would now be seen as, well, they don't really belong here, they belong in Israel. Okay. Any case, so the United Kingdom was the first great power to support Zionism. And as I mentioned, there's no definition of the national home, no boundaries suggested, and of course I highlighted the thing. Now, at the time, there were basically only Mizrahi, that means Jews of North Africa and the Middle East, and some Sephardic, that a number of 24,000 in Palestine. And they were part of an integrated community that were subjected, and not always in a nice way, just like the Muslims or the Christians, by the Ottomans. Okay, the Ottoman Sublime Porte, the Sultan, denied Jews the right to buy land in Palestine or to emigrate, because one of the reasons cited was they feared that they were just Russians that would bring Russian influence, which they feared. Remember the Crimean War and everything? Okay, so the other key factor that is always left out of narratives is what's called the law of taboo, to register lands. The Ottomans wanted all land registered, okay? And the Palestinian indigenous population resisted it because of two things. One, it was much easier to collect taxes. And two, conscription. In the First World War, there were over 500,000 Arabs fighting in the Ottoman army, okay, whether they wanted to or not. So during the time, even though there was proscription against immigration, the population of Jews increased, because there were ways of getting in without being noticed, if you will, and go to Egypt first and then come up from Egypt, etc. Now, the Palestinian Arab Revolt of the Arab Revolt of 1916, which the British, under McMahon, who was the High Commissioner in Egypt, wrote this 10 letters back and forth between and Hussein bin Ali, who was the Sharif, the ruler of Mecca. And what the British were trying to do was to get the Arabs involved in the war against the Turks. Okay? And in those letters, he basically promises the Arabs a nation from Aden to Aleppo. Okay? Now, in the meantime, the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British Commissioner Sykes and Picot of France, that basically decided, okay, when the Ottoman Empire is all carved up, you guys in France, you take northern Greater Syria, which includes Syria of today and Lebanon, and we English are going to take Palestine and Iraq and everything else that we can lay our hands on. Anyway, one of the things that I told you in the Balfour Declaration, for example, Edwin Montagu, who was an anti-Zionist Jew and the highest ranking Jew in the United Kingdom government, the Secretary of State for India, said of the Balfour Declaration, the policy of His Majesty's government is anti-Semitic in result and will prove a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country of the world. So there were those who saw the potential dangers ahead. Now, I divide U.S. policy towards Israel as pre-World War I, post-World War I, post-World War II. The major shift under particularly Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and then another major shift under Trump, which is not really fully explained. So I've already talked to you about Christian salvationism. If you believe in the Old and New Testament as being the Word of God, and that God has a direct impact on the history of what's going on, then in Christian theology of salvationism, you believe that His hand is working, and so Israel has to be Jewish again for the Messiah to come. And if you're on the edge of this evangelicalism, you're looking forward for the Messiah to come because it'll be the end of the world, and you'll enjoy rapture and float up into the skies as you watch everybody else burn. Okay, so I've already talked to you about Blackstone Memorial, Woodrow Wilson, who major tenet was self-determination, but conflicts with this Jewish homeland because he and Lloyd George opposed any ability for them to vote for self-determination. Okay, in 1922, there was a large fish resolution in the Senate which endorsed British mandate of Palestine. The Senate refused to change the Johnson-Reed immigration laws of 1924, which up until that time, anybody could come into the United States except for the Chinese. And the Chinese also included any Asians, whether Filipino, Southeast Asians, Japanese, you're all Chinese. The Exclusionary Act, I think in the 1874, I think it was around that. In any case, this act said, you're from Southern Europe or you're from Eastern Europe, Jewish, okay, you can't come in. If you were Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, you can come in, but like Trump, come in. If we had millions of Norwegians coming in the southern border, believe me, they'd be given passport as they're coming through. Anyway, so they refused to change the immigration laws. So as things in Germany get nastier and nastier and nastier, there's a conference of 32 nations at the town of Evian-les-Bains, which is where Evian water comes from, and to discuss what are we going to do with Jewish refugees. And the conclusion was basically Santo Domingo and I think Honduras with young ones, as many of them can come here as they like. Okay, not a really tempting invitation for a lot of people. If they had known what was to come, probably everybody would have gone. But the Wagner-Rogers bill, I mean, this is our political situation that we have to confront as well, voted down a proposal that would have allowed 20,000 under 14-year-olds Jewish refugees into this country. And the Senate voted it down. Okay. Now, going back to Woodrow Wilson, after you know the establishment of the mandate and everything, and people were starting to talk about real statehood, King Crane Commission was established by Woodrow Wilson, and this is what they concluded. In respect to the creation of a Jewish state in the Middle East, not only you as president, but the American people as a whole should realize that if the American government decided to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, they are committing the American people to the use of force in that area, since only by force can a Jewish state in Palestine be established or maintained. Okay, now you have, as I mentioned, the Arab Revolt, which was very successful because the British and under Allenby and the Arab armies actually captured Damascus to the French horror, but the Sykes-Picot agreement held. And you know, the other thing that the Brits kind of missed on was, you know, they were the main support of the Sharif of Mecca that I mentioned before, Hussein, and unfortunately for him, he lost out to the Ibn Saud family that conquered all of the peninsula. So the Brits were going, okay, we'll give this part of our empire, and you're king now of Iraq, and you are king of Transjordan, and you know they started divvying things up to ameliorate the situation, if you will. Now, the first major outbreaks of violence in Palestine take place in 1920, 21, and 29. They aren't directed against Mizrahi Jews that have been there forever. They're directed against Ashkenazi Jews that, even from Israeli history books, show they didn't integrate. They kept themselves separate, even from Mizrahi Jews. It was like, you know, like German Jews felt about Eastern European Hasidic Jews. They're not really cultured. They don't know anything, etc. And you know, this is where things start to go awry. Now, at that time, there was the birth of the Independence Party, Istiqlal, in Palestine. They're way ahead of the curve from the other Arabs in terms of thinking of independence as self-recognized people with affinities that aren't shared with even people that look, talk, and think like them, because they thought they were just being a political football, even way back then. So the British High Commissioner of Palestine, who was very pro-Zionist, made the comment at that time, under no circumstance should the Jews talk as though the Zionist program required the expulsion of Arabs, because that would cause the Jews to lose world sympathy. So you have two strains going on. One that wants to be very cautious, and one that is much more overt. Now, the League of Nations mandate gave the Jewish Agency representative rights, and even gave Zionist Palestinian citizenship, although Arabs that had left, especially during the famine of post-World War I, when they came back, they wouldn't get those rights. Okay. So things aren't exactly even, but we'll see how the perfidy of the English policies go even deeper. I mentioned Zev Jabotinsky, who in many ways is an intellectual father of the Zionist strain that leads to the Likud, to, even, one could include Ben Gurion at times, Begin, Shamir, Sharon, Netanyahu. He served with distinction under the Zion Mule Corps, the Jewish Legion fighting with the British. And in 1923, so you talked about native populations of the world that resist colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the dangers of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. Now, there were, Zionist leaders who thought we can work with the Arabs and we can live with the Arabs, and they didn't espouse a feeling that it's all ours. Okay. But Jabotinsky and others said, it's all ours. It's got to be ours. There's no room for two. Okay. Then there's the myth of empty space, that nobody's there. Okay. But if you don't want to see, you don't see. And one of the things is that two major parcels of land that the Jewish Agency and the Jewish Colonization Association purchased was the Valley of Mogador and the Jordan Valley. Why? Because the Arab Palestinians didn't farm there because there was salt marshes and too much sand in the soil, and they couldn't grow the principal crops. There was no return on investment. And to the credit of those early Israeli settlers, they drained the marshes, and they almost created a new form of agriculture to make those areas thrive. So yeah, there weren't people there. The populations were actually extremely concentrated, which is important. So I already mentioned about this, but the famine was really awful. A lot of Lebanese came to the United States because of the famine, and may have been one of the causes for the anti-immigration acts. But the population of the whole area had declined significantly by the end of the famine and First World War. Okay, also there was significant inflow of money. So Edmund Rothschild created one of the first huge co-ops in Israel that still exists to this day. Okay. Any case. Now, afterwards, as things are starting to heat up in Europe, and one can foresee that, war is going to come, there's several commissions, 8 that the British have. The most important in many ways is the Peel Commission report, because the Peel Commission, they were looking at the Palestinian revolt against the influx of Jews. Okay, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit in detail, but basically, what they came to, because the Palestinian revolt, there was 2. One was urban, and in 1936, the immigration of Jews to Palestine was about 60,000. Okay, and was starting to really significantly change the demographics. And they saw that the British, with the McMahon promises, etc., were being their typical perfidious selves. So they revolted. It was first urban educated, and they got pummeled. And the leaders were actually sent to, they were called concentration camps by the Brits at that time. They were imprisonment camps in the Seychelles Islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean and to Uganda and Kenya. Okay. But in any case, you can read, that, they recognize the commission that, like Jewish nationalism, Arab nationalism is stimulated by educational system and the growth of the youth movement. It has also been greatly encouraged by the recent Anglo-Egyptian and Franco-Syrian treaties. And also that the mandate should be amended to permit legislation empowering the High Commissioner to prohibit the transfer of land in any stated areas to Jews, so that the obligation to safeguard the right and position of Arabs may be carried out, etc. So basically at that point says, the mandate cannot survive anymore. We have to talk about partition. And this was their partition plan. So this is all, part of Palestine. And this little red area is what the Jews would get, the Zionists. This hatched area would be controlled by the Brits forever to allow Jews access to Jerusalem, and the rest of it would go to the Palestinians. This plan would cause the transference of 220,000 Arabs and 1,250 Zionists. Okay, so the Zionists were not particularly happy about it. And by the way, it wasn't until 1981 that it was discovered that Ben Gurion had mics in the commission's room and overheard everything, all the meetings that were held in camera. So he knew how to he anticipated what they were going to do and how best to react to it. Now, there were those like Menachem Begin, who was pretty young at that time, was like total rejection, and he's going, no, this is the best way that we can move forward. Okay, and so in 1937, he says there could be no question of giving up any part of the land of Israel. It's arguable that the ultimate goal will be achieved most quickly by accepting the Peel proposal. So he's much more of a pragmatist. The Arab reaction, when all the major Arabs and the first Pan-Arab conference of its kind, they outright rejected it. Nope, not going there. Okay, no willingness on their part to accept half a loaf. Okay, so what precipitated it, as I mentioned, was the Great Arab Revolt, and it had a huge impact on the Palestinians. And by the way, this feeling of resistance, which starts in even earlier than the 20s, is embedded in the character of the Palestinians. It's now part of their DNA. 100 years, it's like North Koreans, 6 generations, you start to have a real impact on the way people think and are. When you can't even trust your children or your parents or your siblings, that they might turn you in, it changes human behavior. This started to change Palestinian behavior and, self-awareness. So, as I said, the population, increased, and actually more and more fellahim were being displaced, not just by any Jewish purchases, etc., but a breakdown of certain authority and Bedouins attacking the fallah, the farmers. Okay, so during the first, this period, 400 Zionists and 200 Brits were killed. People, just ignore all this history, but it took over 100,000 British and Zionist auxiliary troops to quell the second part of the revolt that was not urban-based, but countryside-based, and was starting to get more and more and more violent. Okay. Now, the British, as I mentioned, they're great at divide and rule. Okay. They created the Grand Mufti position. Didn't exist before. They wanted to undermine the authority of the Arab executive of Palestinian Congress, that were the educated elite that were thinking in more modern terms. And they created these councils of 4 main tribal groups to counteract it. Now, during this time, there were four different or three major organizations that the Brits helped train, arm. You had the Jewish settlement police at a peak of 15,000. You had the Jewish supernumerary, only the British could come up with a term like that, the supernumerary police, which was at a height of 22,000 and became the nucleus of the Haganah. You had as part of it, I don't know if you want to read about a really interesting character, Captain Charles Ordy Wingate, who was in Ethiopia and during the fight against the Italians to liberate Ethiopia. And he was also known as Mad Dog, just like Millie. You know, Moshe Dayan served under, okay, in the Special Night Operations Group. He was, in a sense, the first British military person to use guerrilla tactics. And then the Guard Corps, which numbered 30,000. So, you know, in 1939, the Brits had a conference, 5.5 weeks between Arab Palestinians and other Arabs and Israelis. They didn't meet in the same room. They came to no agreement. The Arabs were basically rejectionists, okay? But under the Chamberlain White Paper that came after the last commission, they decided to severely curtail Jewish immigration, curtail land purchases, and they promised self-determinations for the Arabs within 10 years. Okay. Now, FDR, you know, the United States wasn't that interested in any of the stuff going on. I mean, it was about the Brits. But after Yalta, you know, Roosevelt already recognized that the Brits were going to be in bad shape because they had spent 50% of their entire wealth fighting the Second World War. So, you know, we do know about the meeting between FDR and King Abdulaziz after Yalta. You know, took the ship, met him outside Alexandria, and he pledged, because the United States was very worried about oil, right? And he pledged that no decision would be taken with respect to the basic situation in that country of Palestine without full consultation with both Arabs and Jews, and he would take no actions in his capacity as chief of the executive branch of this government, which might prove hostile to the Arab people. Okay, that was in a letter to him. Okay, so FDR was against further Jewish immigration. When he passed away, Truman took a completely different tact. Now, during the war, the U.S. Zionist movement at the Biltmore program asserted a much more aggressive Jewish approach on immigration. Remember, before they were like, no, this is, you know, this whole Zionist thing is not a good idea. But with the news of what was happening with the Holocaust, they were like, yeah, we need a safe haven, okay? And they advocated for a Jewish Commonwealth. What that means, I'm not sure. Now, interestingly, there was a Jewish brigade stationed in Treviso, which is in northeast Italy, that area, you know, by Yugoslavia and everything that's contested in Austria. And actually, very, very important because it was critical, especially after the war, in the smuggling trade of arms and refugees. Okay, because these people now knew how to maneuver the whole system, if you will. And as the threat of Rommel dissipated, the Irgun and Haganah became much more active, not against the Arabs, against the Brits, okay? And you had the assassination of Lord Moyne, who was the Minister of State for Middle East in Cairo, assassinated by Lahai, a terrorist group, and actually caused Churchill to turn against the Israelis, the establishment of the Israeli state. Then the King David Hotel, the blowing up of the King David Hotel to get rid of the evidence that had been collected by the British. The British used it as headquarters. They got one wing where the actual head of the British army was on the other side of the hotel. And 91 people were killed, 45 were Brits, but the rest were actually mostly Jews. And it was decried by the Zionist Congress and the Jewish Agency. But Netanyahu on the 60th anniversary said that bombing was legitimate, a legitimate act because it was a military target. Okay, different, things change. Now, the other thing that's not understood is the Aliyah Bet, headed up by what was called Mossad Aliyah Bet. And they established themselves in different processes, especially Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, to tell people, remember, they've been subjugated by other powers, and to say, there's going to be a nation state where you're protected and so on and so forth. Now, it was a completely foreign concept, okay? Now, during this time, even during the war, tens of thousands of refugees made it to Palestine. Some ships were intercepted. People were the refugees were deported to Mauritius, and actually there was one ship that was sunk by Soviet submarines. One ship that was in the port of Haifa was blown up by Haganah because the ship was going to transport the refugees to a faraway place. And they blew it up when they didn't realize that there were 260 Jews, refugees on the ship. Okay. Now, so, the fact that, 6 million Jews that were murdered just because they were Jewish, that was your passport to being killed, unless you were actually a citizen of a recognized state. See, for example, in Romania, they didn't, the Romanians did kill off many of their Jews, but they refused, and the Germans would not take Jews because they were Romanian citizens. It's like Poland. When the Poles Jews fled to Paris and France, they were citizens of Poland. When Poland, during the Ribbentrop-Molotov, disappeared, they were no longer citizens of a country because they didn't exist. So the Jews rushed to the Soviet embassy to try to get Soviet papers. Okay, if you were a Jew of a recognized country, like in Denmark, they didn't collect them. Okay, it's just if you weren't recognized. And one way not to have a recognized country was to take it over, and it no longer existed, right? Anyway, the impact of it is pivotal because I don't believe without it the United States would have changed. Okay, post-World War. Now, these are figures from Tony Ute. I've looked at others, that the United States, to its shame, would not allow Jewish immigration here until really 1951, okay? And then bit by bit, these are DPs. It was really awful. But you see that 332,000 Jews that were stranded, in the displacement camps went to Israel, okay? Now, I'll also tell you this, that if you weren't in good shape, if you weren't young, they didn't want you because they only wanted people that could help build the country and to defend it. And that's just a fact. Now, I'm not saying that that was wrong. If I were in the same position, I'd want to stack the odds in my favor, especially since you've been decimated, But the United States did take the largest number into this country. Harry Truman, infuriated the British government by issuing a statement for allowing 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. Okay, and the U.S. War Department wrote to Truman that to assist Britain in maintaining order against the Arab revolt, an open-ended U.S. commitment of 300,000 troops would be necessary. The immediate admission of 100,000 new Jewish immigrants would almost certainly provoke an Arab uprising, 1947. This is before really the onslaught of DPs are going anywhere. You know, people should look at history and just remind themselves just how awful everything was in Europe. And the Europeans didn't expect the United States to do what it did. They thought they'd do the same thing as World War I. When it's over, we're done with you guys. Boom. You know? Anyway, Britain refused to participate, and they didn't have the money. They didn't want to spend the money on 100,000 troops, etc. And the independence of Transjordan was declared, and the Jewish agency objected to it. And Menachem Begin said, listen, it all belongs to us forever. Okay? He wasn't alone. He wasn't a majority at that time. So Israel declares independence on May 14th. And one of the key things in that war was to grab the Negev and Aqaba. According, not to outside historians, according to Ben-Gurion's own words. So 700,000 Palestinians were expelled and fled. Now, the early part, before the declaration of war, there was a program to get rid of the more intellectualized, middle-class thought leaders of the Palestinians. And they did. They left because before the war started, 300,000 left. Okay? During that war, 13,000 Palestinians killed, 6,373. You know that this is a really accurate number. Nobody knows for sure the number of Palestinians, but it's estimated around that time. You know, the myth that was created to a certain extent was, you know, all these Arab armies are attacking us, etc. There were contingents of 1,000 soldiers from one country, whatever. They had Elmfield 303s, the guns that were used in the Boer War, and were outdated by the First World War, etc. Now, what happened to Israel that was able to capture a great deal of land was they got money mostly from American Jews, and they spent that money on Czech weapons, Polish weapons, and even some Soviet weapons. And they, to the absolute shock of the Egyptian army, the Israeli had an air force that consisted of 24 Avias, which were Czech Messerschmitts, 61 surplus Spitfires. Okay, they were absolutely, it was totally, beyond their belief. And what Ben-Gurion had done for 2 years prior to that was to get the arms which the Soviets supported. Why? Because the Soviets thought those good socialists there will be our key to the Eastern Mediterranean. They got tanks, mortars, etc. So with the exception, and by the way, the Soviets, after 1949, when the first election of the Knesset, when all the pro-communists lost, and nobody won, Stalin was like, okay, enough of that nonsense. But, even Ben-Gurion said, without the Czech weapons, they wouldn't have been able to establish it. And by the way, there were a lot of British, French, and other European and American pilots that flew those. And I read one book by an American pilot who said, excuse my French, it was the biggest piece of crap he'd ever been in, that he could barely keep it up in the air. But it held weapons, bombs, and that's all that counted. Anyway, in Yitzhak Rabin's memoir, which was censored by the Israeli government, okay, the passages were leaked in 1979 to the New York Times, when one part where Rabin spoke with Ben Gurion in July 48 about what to do with the Palestinian center's population, he said, we walked outside, Ben Gurion accompanying us, and Yigal Alon repeated his question, what is to be done with the Palestinian population? Ben Gurion waved his hand in a gesture which said, drive them out. Rabin added, I agreed that it was essential that we drive the inhabitants out. Okay, so this is the map, with the partition of the United Nations. And then what Israel takes is this chunk of land, that it wins in northern Israel, and it takes this big swath of what was Gaza down here, and loses some chunks. Now, the only effective Arab army, to be honest with you, was the Arab Legion of King Abdullah. British trained, British supply, and all the officers were British. And they captured East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Anyway, the USSR, as I mentioned, they were key in approving UN resolution, and it's Truman's decision to recognize Israeli independence. Some attributed to Eddie Jackson, his former Jewish business partner in Missouri, but it fell within the construct of what was to become the Truman Doctrine. The primary goal: keep the Soviets out. Now, had they known that the Soviets were supplying the Israelis, he may well have gone a different way, because people forget how anti-communist people were. Now, Clark Clifford argued, and it's well documented, he was the political advisor, that if Truman wanted to get reelected, he needed Jewish support, and so you had to do this. George Marshall and D. Acheson vehemently opposed the recognition because, and this is what is missed in a lot of histories, they thought that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, would lose, and the American Jews would be pleading for the United States to go in to save them. And they just, didn't believe that it was feasible, or they don't want it to occur. So the green line of the armistice, which became the pre-1967 demarcation line, the armistice demarcation line that both sides signed is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary, and is delineated without prejudice to rights, claims, positions of either party. Well, that didn't last. Okay. The UN Resolution 194, which stated that Palestinian refugees had a right to return and or compensation. Okay. When Israel applied for membership to the United Nations in May of 1949, under Resolution 273, it was based on the condition that they accept all the resolutions in the Charter. And Abba Eban, remember him? He said, yes, absolutely. We will compensate and allow them to return. Okay. Now, one other quick thing about Mizrahi Jews, who are now the majority of Israel. And I'm sure that many of you have been to Israel, but the nature of Israel is different today from when I first went to Israel. It's back then it was definitely more European, definitely in terms of sensibilities and in a lot of different ways. It is a different place today, I would argue, and the majority of the Jews are former Mizrahi, okay? And it's going to become more so because they have more kids, way more kids. So Yemenis, Egyptians, Syrians, and Iraqis were expelled immediately, okay? They lost their property and so on and so forth. Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, no, it didn't happen that way. I'm not saying that there wasn't riots against them that were fomented, but basically, no, they could stay. They had been given rights prior to the Vichy taking over, but most started to leave because, their commercial interests started to become more and more prescribed. Things weren't going their way, especially after 67. Moroccan Jews, the ones who had stayed there, there was like, we're done because this is starting to feel more hostile, even though the King Hassan wanted to keep them. But most of Iran's Jews left post 79 Islamic Revolution. Okay, there were 160,000 Jews in Iran. Okay, and about 80,000 have left since 79. There's still about 10,000 Jews, I believe, in Iran. Okay, now when they came, in many ways, and it's from Jewish Israeli historians, they were given sort of a second-class status, not given the economic opportunities and so on and so forth, and a lot of resentment. A lot of that resentment turned against Ashkenazi Socialist Labor Party, and they aligned themselves more and more with Likud. Okay, they had no tradition in any of these countries of any kind of democracy that Ashkenazi understood. They understood European history. And so I would argue it's changed. Now, the Suez Crisis, I want to quickly go through this. Why did Israel participate in what the British and the French wanted to get the Suez Canal back after it was nationalized? Because they didn't, Ben Gurion really worried about Nasser. He wanted him out of power. And they wanted to also have better control over the Sinai. So, the United States threatened Britain with economic destruction by telling the Prime Minister of Eden, oh, by the way, we're going to sell all our pound sterling bonds. Okay, that would have collapsed the British economy. And they stopped immediately. And so the French had to, and the Israelis didn't actually withdraw until much later. I mean, well into 57. But what it also allowed is for the Soviets to play their hand in Egypt. And it signified the end of Britain's role as one of the world's great powers. That was it. Now, one of the things it also allowed to do is the Soviet Union, under the cover of the Suez Crisis, invaded Hungary. Because all the attention was on the Suez, and they said, we can deal with Hungary the way we want to. So Palestinian resistance starts in Gaza. And actually, Arafat, as despicable character as he is, he was actually tortured by the Egyptian secret police in Gaza. No love lost between the Palestinians and the Arabs. I'll just tell you that. Ben Gurion was much more militant in certain ways. And, a lot of people were killed in Gaza in names that are becoming known, Rafah and Khan Yunis. There were over 1,000 Palestinians that were summarily executed because they were suspected of being part of the resistance movement. JFK is the first president to extend military credits. Remember, during the Israeli war, Truman imposed an arms embargo. I failed to mention that. No arms to Israel, no arms to the Arabs. That's why the Israelis knew what was coming. Ben Gurion was, you could say a lot about him, but he was a sharp cookie. And he was like, the Czechs need money, okay? I mean, and they still had munition factories and armament factories. Anyway, the United States went to Egypt because they saw Egypt, it's the big country there. Israel is like, no, Egypt's the powerhouse. And Egypt's going, we're not interested in any allegiance with you. Okay, so the United States focused all their Middle Eastern attention to what's called the Northern Tier, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and Iraq. Okay, and so the Shah becomes central to American foreign policy. Now, Nasser turned to USSR for weapons, which absolutely shocked the West. Why? Not because of Suez, but because Allen Dulles prevented the World Bank from loaning the money necessary for the Osman ban. Okay? So later in 67, okay, the United States assessment, and I can tell you this because my father at that time was an ambassador and he was near that area and he had, he could see all the communication. The estimate was that the Israelis would defeat the Arabs in 3 days. Okay, the American defense ones. And McNamara, I put it in nicer language, the Israelis will whip the out of them. Okay, anyway, so Nasser wanted to be head of the Arab world and he tried the Pan-Arab Union with Syria and he wanted to be the spokesman. And he hated the Saudis and the presence of capitalism within Saudi Arabia and pumping out all the oil and so on and so forth. Remember, the Egypt under Nasser had 70,000 troops in Yemen fighting the royalists for 8 years, from 62 to 1970. So unfortunately, just like Saddam Hussein, and having lived in the Arab countries, they're hoisted by their own petard. They like to say, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. And unfortunately, if somebody else takes them at their word, you're gonna be in trouble. And he saw that they were gonna be in trouble. He didn't want a war, not with Israel. He also knew that they would get their rear ends kicked in. He sent the vice president of Egypt, who left the night of the 5th to Morocco and then to come to the United States to meet with the administration to see how they could back off. And the thing is, I have here, because recent histories all say, oh, the Israelis got the green light from the president. LBJ, Dean Rusk, and McNamara, all in their own histories, all claim nobody asked them permission. They did it. They talked about what they would do, but they didn't say, oh, can we have our permission, your permission, please? That's not the way the Israelis operate. Now, I got news for you. We have some influence, but not that much influence. Okay? To this day, Biden can say, listen, we don't want you to do this, but they'll only take that only so far. Because for them, they're thinking in different existential terms. Okay, so later on, 4 major generals of the Israeli IDF, years later, all admitted there was no real threat. The Arabs did not pose a threat. Okay, so the story that propagated here, and it's what it is, a propaganda. Remember, up until that time, it was French weapon, Mirage fighters, etc. It wasn't American. Okay. Now the war it cost a lot, including 250,000 more refugees from Palestinian refugees. And by the way, if you've never heard of the USS Liberty incident, it was the most sophisticated intelligence ship in the United States Armed Forces. Okay, it was about 70 miles off of the coast of Gaza and Suez, north of Suez. Okay, we had the 6th Fleet there. It was positioned about 120 miles off the coast, and it was attacked.
It's
3 times by Israeli aircraft and patrol boats.
There's no discussion.
34. Can you please mute if you're on Zoom? Can you please mute?
He is putting out particular quote.
Please mute. We can hear you.
What really happened, or the majority of thinking to support it.
Right.
Please forget it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're talking and we can hear you, which we don't want to. Okay. So to be blunt. So in any case, the fact is that investigation was a complete whitewash. 6 weeks, no testimony. It was really pretty terrible. And LBJ just, swept it under the carpet. And the reason for it was, there's 2 theories. One is we knew that the Israelis were going to continue their attack on Syria, and then they went as far as 20 kilometers outside of Damascus. Remember, at the end of the war. The other was, and I've read this in two places, but there's no verification. It's Sharon, who was brigadier general in charge of one of the armies in Sinai, that they lined 200 Egyptian officers and shot them, and that this ship picked up even walkie-talkie, everything, and they didn't want that from coming out. So who knows? In any case, the Israelis eventually paid compensation to the families, but it wasn't very much. And actually, the United States really gave them money to pay them back. I mean, anyway, things happened during World War II. But the defeat of the Arabs actually paradoxically resuscitated Palestinian national determinism. And you have some extremists, and we had all the hijackings and the murders on the cruise ships, and et cetera, et cetera. And for the Israelis, in many ways, it served their purpose because they could equate all Palestinian resistance with terrorism. Then, in '68, the PLO actually gained remarkable credence within the Arab world when they fought with the IDF in the West Bank, and gave a little bit of a bloody nose. But Nixon and Kissinger changed everything, because their goals were twofold. USSR out, no pan-Arab unity. Do not allow pan-Arabism, okay? Because they thought that was a bigger threat to, if you had real pan-Arab unity, to Israel. Now, the UN 242 resolution that everybody refers to, unfortunately, what people don't understand is, one, is when it says withdraw from territories occupied, in French, which the Israelis don't accept, but it's an official diplomatic language, it says des territoires occupés, which means of the occupied territories. The Israelis prefer the nebulous territories, not the territories. And secondly, this little thing within secure borders gives them the out. We're not going to withdraw because we don't have secure borders. So there's nothing about no sanctions, no mention of Palestinians, etc. And in many ways, the United States wrote that UN resolution. Now, the '73 war, the thing that's always missed in my mind is that Sadat proposed a peace plan to Golda Meir before the war in March, okay? And she rejected it outright. By the way, it's the same peace plan as what Sadat ended up with. But she was absolutely adamant. The USSR was not going to lose because they saw their position being there was key, and they rearmed like crazy. We rearmed like crazy. Nixon went to DEFCON 3, and then Kissinger did his 160 days of shuttle diplomacy, and he succeeded. But one of the secrets, if you will, wasn't discovered till much later, other administrations, is that there was a secret memorandum with the Israelis that states the United States would not take a position on Palestinians without the okay of the Israeli government, okay, which hampered our ability to do things. Now, the last time the USSR was involved was the co-equal partner of the Geneva Peace Conference, which really ticked Sadat off, because what Sadat wanted was not to have a pan-Arab approach, but he wanted Egypt to get back his Sinai. That's all he was interested in. And by having this kind of whole approach, it undermined him. So what did Sadat do? He went to the Knesset. That's why he did it, to undermine the peace conference, because he wanted to deal one-on-one with the Israelis to get the Sinai back. Okay, so you have discussions that go on. The PLO is expelled from Jordan. you have all these Palestinians. I was supposed to go to Lebanon to a school there, and the war broke out. Okay, and why? Because the presence of the Palestinians helped to destabilize the National Pact of 1943, which said, "Oh, there's 50% Christians, 50% Muslims, etc." And this is how the official offices are going to be. Now you have 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 Palestinians. And in any case, nobody was taking a census because the whole thing would explode. But it did explode. And, it's led to, I would argue that Lebanon is completely dysfunctional, and that Hezbollah is there because when Israel's occupation of the first war and then the second war, 300,000 Shia were displaced. Okay, and then the PLO is kicked out, sent to Tunisia. There's enormous devastation in Lebanon, and it still hasn't recovered, and it may get invaded again. Now, in terms of the United States, we've succeeded, except that Russia is now in Syria, thanks to Obama's policy. We've given Israel $150 billion in aid, okay, since 1949. I mean, most of it is post 1967. The impact of OPEC oil and the embargo, everybody remembers that. And, the Arabs were all villains in that thing. Hell, you have to pay much more for part of your income for gas. Okay. And then the fall of the Shah of Iran. I mean, our whole Middle Eastern policy was predicated on the Shah, who, by the way, supported Israel. Okay. Then you have the Intifada, the first Intifada. Why? Because, the promises that seemingly were made were being fulfilled. And they saw that Arafat was basically pretty corrupt and self-serving, as most of the BA were. And so the first Intifada was, pretty bad, but not like the second Intifada. And this is when Hamas starts to become more and more of a factor. Now, Bush Sr., he had the Madrid conference, and it was a bust, except for one thing. The Israelis were talking directly with the Palestinians at back channel. Nobody knew. Americans suspected it, but nobody knew. And that was key because there would have never been an Oslo or anything afterwards. Okay. So the Camp David Summit, the one thing you might often hear from Dennis Ross, okay, who portrays himself as this very, neutral, etc. Far from it. And one of the things that I thought was despicable, but in character of Bill Clinton, was when he invited Arafat to the Camp David Summit, he said, if the meeting doesn't work, I won't blame you. Okay. Dennis Ross started promulgating this myth that Arafat was all his rejection. Actually, Arafat wrote Clinton a letter, and he said, I agree to all of this, but we don't understand these points. He didn't reject it. But on the other hand, if he had accepted it, he would have had a bullet in his head, because nobody from Clinton, Israel, or whatever, has ever produced a map that showed what a Palestine would look like. Because even a 10-year-old would go, well, that's not going to work. Okay, a continuous state. So what the agreement did was divide the West Bank into 3 areas: C, A, B, and C. C, 60% of the land under complete and direct administrative Israeli control. A, which is 18%, the Palestinians are given administrative and security control. And B, the most important in many ways, the Palestinian Authority, only has administrative control. It's where 87% of the Palestinian population is. Now, they're also, the Palestinians have to pay for the cost of the Israeli security in A, B, and C through taxation. And 75% of the taxes are collected and go through Israel. And for example, right now, they won't disperse any of the tax money so that in the West Bank, none of the officials are getting money. Okay, so I just want a couple of things. Major General Shlomo Gazit in 1994 said that Yasser Arafat has a choice. He can be Lahad or Super Lahad. Lahad was the commander of the Israeli paid and trained for Southern Lebanese army that no longer exists. It was supposed to be the buffer army, right? And in fact, that's what the PLO, the PA became. They had to administer security against Palestinians, even anything they did against Israeli settlers or anything. So you can imagine that the population doesn't really care about them at all. And the other thing is Jerusalem was completely disconnected from the West Bank. The second intifada was even worse because Hamas led, it's estimated that 50 to 60% of those people crossing over and blowing themselves up and killing a whole bunch of Israelis were Hamas. Okay. And so Palestinians were like, yeah, even our PA can't do anything. So what did it result in? A lot of people dying, but the biggest thing, the barrier, the walls, the partitioning of B and C and A into 20 different little pockets where you need special passes to go from one to the other. So if you have no hospital and you got to rush, if you don't have the right color pass, you got to wait in line and maybe wait 3-4 hours to get through. Okay, it causes a lot of resentment. Now in Gaza was always the center of Palestinian resistance. Okay, and I will just tell you that it's a disaster. Yes, they could have taken a different turn, but Hamas won that election. They never held another election because they wouldn't win another election. And the Fatah was stupid enough in 2007 to try to take out Hamas. And a lot of the Palestinian Authority were killed. Okay, and it's a prison. It is a prison. Now, this is the third major incursion. The last one in 2014 resulted in 13,000 Palestinians being killed. There's a doctrine that is in the IDF. It's called the Dahia Doctrine. It's collective punishment. Okay, somebody takes one of you out, you're going to take 100 or more. That is a IDF tenet. I don't care what they say on the media. That has existed, and it started especially in Lebanon in 1982. Now, unfortunately, the U.S. Arms Export Control Act prescribes the use of U.S. arms, except in self-defense. So that's why Israel keeps claiming it's all in self-defense. Only Carter forced Begin to back down in Lebanon and said, if you don't, we're not exporting any more arms. And the military operation ended 2 days later. Okay, so this is what I'm ending up with. Why has Israel, and for the Arabs, they've been recalcitrant, rejectionists, etc. It's taken them 70 years to coming around to the idea that Israel isn't going anywhere and that we have to accept some kind of modus vivendi. Not all, but I would say a majority. What I would say is that the cost of a deal for Israel is much, much higher than the cost of no deal. The cost of a deal is much higher. Why? Well, okay, are you going to accept Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem, where there are now 225,000 Jews living? Are you going to give them the authority over Temple Mount? Are you going, every negotiation that Israel's had since 47 have given it a better position, not a weaker one. And, I go to Moshe Dayan's quote, our American friends offer us money, arms, and advice. We take the money and the arms, we decline the advice. Okay? Bacon's philosophy and Netanyahu's, they'll give them autonomy for people, but not the land. And Trump, what did he do? He said, yeah, Palestine doesn't have to be a contiguous state. They won't be sovereign. They'll just be an autonomous state. There'll be no settlement removal now that there's 700,000 in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, which was part of UN resolutions throughout the years in the Oslo Accords, no, that's a done deal. Don't pay attention to that. Don't pay any attention to the UN 181. Yes, you can annex land if you conquer it. And there's no recognition for Palestinian refugees. The Trump administration tried to liquidate the UNRWA, which has supported the refugee camps, by defunding it, because we're the major contributor. So, the United States under Trump saw it, and he's completely transactional. I don't care what you say, it's just transaction. And he says, well, the reason I take the stand that I do is that it appeals to our evangelicals and to our Jacksonian outlook of things. Now, Netanyahu, I would argue, is also to blame for what has happened. Why? Because his policy, 20 years, is to divide the Palestinian Authority and to say, I don't have to deal with these idiot Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas and the others. They don't even really run things. You got Hamas, and who am I supposed to deal with? Hamas or without? It suits his purpose, or has. He has made it clear in statements and video clips that he's not interested in Palestinian state. And life in the West Bank has increasingly become both economically and socially intolerable. So, there's more and more violence towards Palestinians in the West Bank. And as I mentioned before, Shin Bet, and there was a big story in the New York Times about how they knew over a year ago how Hamas was really getting its money. And they did nothing, even though the head of the financial terrorism thing said there's plenty of stuff we could have done to disrupt it. Okay, Netanyahu felt that dealing just with states, Arab states, and having agreements with them could ignore the Palestinian issue. Now, what Hamas did was to destroy any chance of a Saudi-Israeli-US treaty and to keep the issue on Palestinians. And the actions against Gaza, to me, appear to make the place uninhabitable. That is, I don't care what they're saying, that they're going to make it uninhabitable to force 2.2 million Palestinians out. And the danger is that this will threaten the stability of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, all the states, because the man on the street in those countries will not tolerate that to occur. And it enhances Iran's position. So what I see is you have four choices. Israel holds on to the occupied territories, and it becomes increasingly undemocratic based on race and religion, and it will result in an apartheid type state as defined by the United Nations. That Israel accepts the two-state solution with real sovereignty, other than military, okay, causing enormous turmoil within Israel due to the necessary settler population moves. Israel could, third, become a single nation in which Jews might very likely become a minority, which undermines the whole purpose of the project, if you will. And four, that there will be an increased chance of a conflict with destabilized Islamic states with a potential for much wider conflagration including the potential for nuclear weapon use. And, you know, in 1967, US intelligence said that the Israelis, no, 73, not 67, 1973, that the Israelis armed 12 nuclear weapons when Golda Meir was panicking. Okay, it's not unthinkable. It is not unthinkable. So, you know, to me, you know, this crisis could have been avoided if people had taken slightly different tacks. The United States, did nothing. In fact, I hold us responsible for Hamas being in power because we were the only party who said Hamas has to run to make it look democratic. You know, so anyway, I know I went on too long, but it's a complex issue, and there's a stream here. There is, yeah, I would say no right and wrong. There is no right and wrong. Both peoples have to accept a half a loaf. They have to. Otherwise, you know, we can all become evangelicals looking for the rapture.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you for a very detailed explanation of the situation. And now we open the floor for questions. I hope you're willing to
You know, I'm
answer.
sorry that I went on longer. Every time I thought of taking away, and I did take actually 10 slides away, but because you start to remove pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and it no longer makes sense. Anyway, so yes, I'm here for as long as you would.
What are they going to do with the 2.2 million Palestinians that are being forced out of Gaza? Where are they going to go in your?
Egypt does not want them, cannot take them. Egypt is very unstable economically. It's a very repressive regime that we support. I mean, when I say very repressive, I lived there when it was repressive, right? But now there's probably estimated 60 to 100,000 political prisoners that are tortured, that live in, you think prisons are bad in Turkey from that movie, you know, whatever it was.
Midnight Express.
Yeah, the ones in Egypt are just so awful, you can't even picture. So I don't know, they don't want Hamas. They do not want Hamas. So they would probably prefer for all those people to starve to death in Stein.
But isn't Egypt facilitating the arms going into?
I don't think that,
Gaza?
no, I don't think so. You know, the thing is that you have to understand two things. The Arabs have smuggled for millennia, okay? And the Bedouins know how to do things. And the Bedouins only do things for money. That's all, you know, money. Yep.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask, your slide presentation is superb. And I was just wondering if it's possible for us to get a
Yeah,
copy.
for all members of the club, this is being recorded.
Okay, good, thank you.
Any other,
Where is it on YouTube?
other questions?
It's been recorded to the cloud, so yeah, there's you know, all the recorded things are in a location, and you know, if need be, we can put it out somewhere so that, you know.
Right here.
Yeah.
How do you interpret today's announcement by Islamic State that they're behind the Iran bombing?
Well, you know, Iran is Shia, and the Sunnis are discriminated against, and there are actions that have been taken, especially in eastern part of Iran, that has really ticked off some of the Sunnis. It's why does say ISIS of Afghanistan? They've been blowing up mosques with you know, of the Taliban, because you know, they're attempting to position themselves for more power. I mean, it's pure terrorism because they can't really do anything. They can't really affect change. Yes.
I don't have a question. I just want to thank you for this wonderful detailed presentation. And I'm sure it took you lots of time to put it together. And I thought it was really informative and thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, there's a question in the back, Don Wise.
First off, I'll echo that man's comment and Happy New Year to everyone.
Happy New Year.
And I will ask you, when you look at maps, why, maybe it's self-evident, that the Egyptians won't allow the Palestinians to cross over into the Sinai? Because the Sinai, from the maps that I've looked at, have locations, venues, where there is water and people could be supported.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, first of all, they've been fighting a kind of guerrilla insurgency type war for decades. And there's two different populations. One, the Bedouins. Okay, Bedouins don't like to settle down by their very nature. But as more importantly, I'm not sure that they could survive without a huge amount of money. But the way the Egyptians look at it is they'll be getting more Hamas people coming into their land, and they've been fighting Ikhwan Muslimin in Sinai for 20 years. You know, they don't want more of them. So yeah, there's no love lost between Palestinians and Egyptians. They don't like each other.
What is your take on all the incidences of the Israeli attacking the Palestinians in the West Bank?
Well, I mean, there is a chunk of the coalition that wants all the West Bank Palestinians out. They want them out. Okay, and what I was trying to allude to is there's been this strain going all the way back, to its foundation, where what they said is, it's all ours, we're gonna take it, we gotta get all these people out. And that hasn't gone away.
I don't know if you've read Tom Friedman's op-eds in the last month or so. He had these proposals as a pan-Arab sort of task force to look out. I noticed he didn't have anything in the last few days. But the lead article in the New York Times today, the final paragraph talks about Macron meeting with Benny Gantz, somebody that's just under Bibi Netanyahu. In terms of your entire presentation, Britain being a little bit of the nanny for many years, and then the US, what is your proposal? And as a this is a side question, if it's the Christian end of times people that, are, have been political supporters on one side or the other, what is the theological basis that the Jewish people want the homeland? It's primarily in reaction to World War II. But related to that, if you have time at the end, could you talk about USAID? I mean, wasn't that a part of a lot of, I don't know. I just had a friend that used to always talk about USAID.
Yeah, I have a very good friend. We shared the same apartment in Cairo who was USAID. But in general, those are very much non-political developmental type programs and specific to various subjects. Look, to answer the question, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but there are two passages, at least in what we in the Christian the West refer to as the Old Testament. One is mandating the Jews to reestablish Israel. The other stating that it cannot happen until the Messiah comes. And so the way evangelicals perceive it, and if there's an evangelical person here, I apologize for any comments that I may have made to offend you, but the fact is that it substantiates the belief that God's hand is actually driving events, and that that Israel has to be all of Israel, Samaria and Judea included. That once that happens, the Messiah comes, and then we got end of times.
When
Okay,
is it coming?
I don't care as long as he's not late for dinner.
Is there any control over the nuclear weapons with all of these factions? Is anybody paying any attention to security or movement or, of course, terrorism? Could you say anything at all about
Well,
that?
I would just say that yeah, obviously the Israelis have control. It's estimated that they may have between 200 and 300 nuclear weapons, which put them in the same league as Great. Yeah, some say even 425. I'm going conservative, but that would put them on par with the UK and France. Not insignificant. They have controls internally. So if they were to use them, it would be a governmental decision to do so. What other nuclear weapons? I mean, look, the United States was the one that forced the agreement for Ukraine to give up all of its nuclear weapons, right? In exchange for a permanent boundary that also included Crimea. And look where that got us, because imagine if Ukraine had, but the biggest worry the United States had was that the Ukrainian government couldn't control what might happen to some of those nukes. And that some corrupt general might sell them off to some group. That's what we were doing. So who's got nuclear weapons? Pakistan? Trust me, we keep a very, very close eye on what Pakistan does. What North Korea does. I don't think North Korea would be interested. I don't think that really Pakistan is that interested. Now, Iran, how close are they to a nuclear weapon? Probably could happen this year, and once the cat's out of the bag, what do you do? What do you do?
Regarding the title of your talk.
Yeah.
Two wrongs make a right.
The land of two rights. Well, I say that, that both the Palestinians and the Israelis have rights. I may have argued differently because I happen to believe that the United States has been a shelter for all peoples. And while there can be discrimination at times, that it's shelter for all peoples, that nobody really needs to worry. Now, I understand why people worried after the Jewish Holocaust. I understand, but you can't peel back 100 years of history. It is what it is. So they have certain rights. I don't base it on biblical. They just have a right for someplace. It's the escape hatch, whatever you want to call it. The Palestinians also have rights, which they've been denied. And as I said, we have to get to the position, and only this country has ever been in a position to say, you have to do this, but we haven't wanted to. For political, because I would argue all US foreign policy is domestic.
Thank you very much again, Ed.
Yeah.
For next week, next month.
Oh, I can one more thing. On the 12th, okay, we're having a celebration, and I'm just going to come straight out and tell you, it's a celebration of Ashkenazi culture. We have a klezmer band, and the menu is basically an Eastern European Jewish menu, not Mizrahi. Okay.
All right. Next month. We have the booklets available here for those who ordered them. But the topic of the very first chapter is similar somewhat to what we have discussed today. So instead of reading the first chapter and discussing it, we're going to have another special meeting. The special meeting is about Peter